Hi, my name is Captain Brian Healy. I worked with the Inotech Aviation and Canada Centre for Remote Sensing for something in excess of 30-odd years. Flew the Convair for 31 years. Enjoyed it a great deal. It was a great airplane to fly. It was a conversion from the old 340 Convairs, and when that conversion took place, a lot of things were done to the aircraft that made it particularly apropos for remote sensing, in this particular case carrying a lot of heavy-duty electronic cargo in the radar development through CCRS. One of the things that was really important was when the airplane was converted to the 580 in 1962, they put on two big engines with twice the horsepower that the aircraft had in the first place. And if anybody knows anything about flying airplanes, when you got one engine out on one side and one at full bore on the other side, there's a lot of yaw going on. And you got to be able to do something to control that. So they had to increase the size of the rudder in order to manage that problem, one that doesn't very often happen. In fact, I never had in 31 years and the 4,000 some odd hours that I flew it, never had a real engine failure, which speaks to the reliability of the airplane. It was a great airplane for doing what it was doing. It was all weather, long range fuel tanks. We could get somewhere, you could go to Europe, etc., things like that, and put in some very long sorties. I know on a trip to Japan, one of the sorties we went on for a month, we took the airplane out in the westerly direction to get to Japan, and we had to do some sorties. In one case, we were 7.5 hours in the air going to Midway from ADAC. There were a lot of other interesting stories about that trip we might get into later, but that's the kind of capacity you need in a research airplane like this, because you spend a lot of time in the air with new equipment that is unknown, untried. The guys in the back are fixing. They're often fixing, so you spend a lot of time flying around getting fixed so that you can carry on with the rest of the program. But what else can I say about it? It was a comfortable airplane to fly. Being in it as long as I was, I said previously, it was almost, I knew the airplane as well as I knew my wife, and I always knew when it was getting sick. You just have a feeling for it when you've been in an airplane so long. Something sounds different, something feels different, something is strange, you know it right away. And you can usually pinpoint the problem as a rule.
All right. So my name's Jinyak, and I flew the CCRS Convair from 1981 to the end of '86, for 6 years. I came into the company to Inotech from a corporate job in Montreal after I'd left the military. And I'd flown Convairs in the military before at the 412 Squadron, both in Canada and in Europe. Really enjoyed my time. It was very different because suddenly I found myself in an air crew position where you just had the crew. You just go somewhere. You don't have the passengers. No passengers, no freight, just the crew. Go somewhere, do the job, and come back, and without the complications of passenger handling. It was nice. It was a good crew. It was almost like family. Huh? We always worked together. We're all the same people together.
Yep.
And because, as Brian said earlier, it was a developmental piece of gear. We spent a lot of time waiting for them in the back to fine-tune it, to repair it. And we worked all together to make it happen. In some places where I remember Chuck Livingston borrowing transistors and stuff from the CBC North so we could go flying in the afternoon. And I left eventually in '86 because my wife, I got married while we were there at Inotech, started to have kids, And the first one, we were very busy one year. The first one was a year old. He had no idea who I was. And this is true. And my wife suggested I should find a job where I might be around to change a few diapers. And she had a point. So I took a more sedentary job with the Department of Transport after that. But I always remember very well my time at CCRS with the Convair. It was a super employment.
Super stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Bob Hawkins. I was a research scientist at the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, and I came as a postdoc to CCRS in 1978. And I really didn't appreciate what I had walked into because we just got this wonderful aircraft. It had just been refitted. Brian and a whole host of professional pilots were there to service us. We had an exciting time because we were cutting new ground. And I had no sense of that. I just worked with a bunch of guys that were enthusiastic beyond means. And over the years, I moved slowly into working with the people in the aircraft. And that was a privilege by itself. Most scientists work in an environment by themselves, and they kind of poke their way through. But when you work with remote sensing, you work with professionals. These were guys that had years and years of experience planning missions, doing work, and making things happen. And that was a super privilege for me. I was not a guy who flew the airplane, although I got to sit in the jump seat once in a while. I once deployed the flaps, I remember, but I was a GIB, a guy in the back. And I came across, while we were looking at some of the stuff in the archives of the museum, the little clipboards we had.
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
There's one that's marked SOB. The scientists on board.
Yeah, of
so
course,
I
that's what
still
it
have
means.
that one.
It wouldn't be. We wouldn't use anything different.
Anything derogatory.
There are others for other operators where they went and so on, but I enjoyed working with these guys, and I think Brian said it best once: when you go on a mission, there's something that happens that you form a team. And everybody rows in the same direction. You may have a captain calling the shots, but everybody pitches in to get the job done.
There.
Has to be a team effort.
Yeah.
And we didn't sleep together. We slept in the same hotel, but we ate together. We worked together morning to night. It was fantastic.
We didn't drink.
Yeah. No, we didn't drink.
No, of course not. Wine and cheeses only.
Yeah,
Wine and
of
cheese
course.
was Brian's specialty. Okay.
Flights were long, so you don't get that many cycles. Yeah. You get lots of hours, but you don't get a lot of cycles.
You were on a fifth build, amazing.
Don't forget, in its previous lifetime, it was a corporate aircraft. That may go out once every 2 weeks with the president of Johnson & Johnson.
Right.
And yeah, they'll go a long way. They bought this airplane, and Johnson & Johnson had the big tanks installed, right down to the keel.
Yeah.
20,000 pounds of fuel. You're good for 10 hours. But can you imagine how far you can go, with the old man, with the president of the company?
Yeah, and they'd have, 5 or 6 people on board or something?
Or a dozen max.
Yeah,
and
for
sure. They're not payload limited. They can go with full fuel and go all the way to South America. And I think they did. That airplane has a special authority to go in and out of La Paz.
Oh yeah. Wow.
If you look at the back of the performance.
So what other things, like I think the other night you were mentioning that because it was a corporate airplane for executives, it had some special stuff.
Well, they really want to be a self-contained thing, power-wise, electrical power, air conditioning. So that's why they had the Stinger in the back rather than just a GTC. Most of these, the great majority of these Convairs have just a GTC, and just for air start, and that's all. So if you take that same piece of equipment, move it to the tail, much like a Boeing, now you can have electricity from it, you can have air conditioning. In your case, you can even have backup pressurization in a pinch if your EDC fails. So it was a real asset for them to go somewhere where there's nothing and be self-contained and have comfort for the crew, for the people and the passengers.
Which in turn made it a good asset for this operation.
Yeah,
especially in the north, because it had to be standalone.
Yeah.
It had to be a standalone airplane in order to do the kind of stuff we were doing. We needed the big fuel tanks to do the number of hours in the air that we did.
Yeah.
And you want to go anywhere in Canada, which is so big, you know, you need some airtime to get there.
Yeah.
And
Now,
so
but I remember when we'd be, you know, typically there'd be 2 hours of warming up, getting the equipment going.
in the Arctic, it was really difficult, and it did take that at least.
And we'd use that Stinger
and
for
the
that.
Stinger would be the driver
Yeah.
for the most part. It gave us power, it gave us the air to heat the airplane. It would take 3 hours to get the stuff ready to get off the ground,
Yeah.
quite easily, especially when it was minus 40.
I remember Inuvik in December when we were doing the Canmar, the Dome Petroleum support operations. It was forever getting the thing, and you got to warm it up slowly. You can't thermal shock any of the systems. So, and it's not just the equipment in the back, but the engines and the gearboxes and the propellers as well. Otherwise, you're going to blow seals and lose oil, and then you can't go.
Yeah.
And then
So-
in the original configuration, we had those crazy camera boxes that recorded recorded the SAR data. And they were made of magnesium. They were about 8 feet long,
Yeah, right on
and they
the
had to be
cylinders.
warmed up to a specific temperature to work at all and to be in focus to
Be the right
record
length
the stuff.
to be the right
To
length to
be the right
record.
length to
Yeah, I
record.
remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was just terrible. We used to put heating blankets on them to try and keep them warm all night when the airplane was
Oh,
shut
really?
down. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. We put heating blankets.
We would
on.
plug it in Inuvik. We'd plug it in at night with
Yes.
baseboards inside the aircraft, as much as possible. It'd still go down to minus 30 something instead of minus 40. So
Yeah.
you've gained 10 degrees. It will be.
But then that
Yeah.
gave me a couple hours to make everybody breakfast while we were warming up and getting ready to go.
You know, I still...
On board.
One thing that's not in the airplane that I wish we still had was the coffee pot. You remember that breadboard? I can still remember the scientist on board's job was to get that coffee going as soon as we took off.
That's right. That's right.
Now, I remember, Andre, one of your things you talked about was taking that radome down.
Oh, changing the antenna.
Talk about that.
Oh, in Inuvik. Oh, what a gruesome task.
Oh yeah.
Huh?
It
They
is.
would. We would.
You'd be outside, no hangar.
Oh yeah, no.
No,
You're
no,
on the
no
ramp,
hangers.
and it's minus something with a terrible wind direct from Siberia, and you got to drop the antenna, drop the radome to change the antenna, and
So the skirts come off,
Skirts
and
come
then
up.
they flip up.
well
and then
before that,
Yeah.
they would build a tent over the back of the airplane
Yep.
and install a couple heaters. Who
Herman
would
Nelsons.
Herman Nelsons to put some
Some
bit of
heat.
heat in there, but God help you if you drop anything on the ground because you're working. It's tiny stuff, so you
can't
don't
wear
have
gloves.
You're not wearing gloves, okay? It's all tiny stuff, and you're working very gingerly with very expensive equipment. If you drop something on the ground and you go to reach for it, this hurts. I mean, it's terrible.
And everybody's there.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Everybody's
It's,
there.
The
Everybody's there
pilots,
helping.
ground crew.
it's not just the technicians.
Yeah.
It's everybody's working on
Everybody's
this.
working
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah.
And that was the interesting part about that. We had to change antennas quite often, as you know, because we had L, C, and X band
Yeah.
at one point.
Yeah.
We could only carry 2 antennas, and that was a mod that occurred later. We originally could only put 1 in there.
Yeah.
And finally we got 2, but every time we wanted the third one, we'd have to take one off and put the other one on.
Yeah. Yeah.
it was quite a chore, especially in the Arctic. It was awful up there.
Well, it was development work, and they were still feeling their way about trying to decide
Yeah,
what
that's
the
right.
final configuration was going to be.
Well, that's pretty low. That might be 3 feet or something from the ground.
Yeah,
What,
about that.
what
feet, yeah,
happens
4 feet.
Well,
when
there
you
were-
take off and land? Is that an issue?
Well, it can be. There are restrictions on the airplane. You can't operate the airplane in its full normal envelope because you could strike the antenna on the ground on landing and takeoff in certain flap configurations.
So-
But when we did the mod for the military Aurora radar system, we put a bigger radome on it.
Yeah.
It dropped it down another 8 inches.
8
Now
more.
we had done a test flight program with that radome initially to prove what we could or could not do in terms of flap positioning on takeoff.
And
so on.
and that's the one that took away the 5 flap departures.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
And 10 as
And
well.
10s.
But when we dropped the other radome down further, it was even worse, supposedly.
Yeah.
So I did a test flight program to prove that there was going to be no problem with this radome.
Yeah.
And it worked fine, and we never got anywhere near close to the ground. We still had the same flap restrictions because it becomes an STC, and you
Yeah.
can't change that.
Yeah.
But there was no problem with the extra 8 inches on the radome at all because the airplane starts lifting off far sooner than you get the full pitch up on it.
Oh, okay.
So you're
Off
up
the
off
ground.
the oleos
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
getting off the ground. So never came close.
Yeah. What about now the second antenna above there? What's that one for?
I don't know. That wasn't there in my days. That's after I
the-
departed.
After
The
84,
canoe. That's
eh?
your canoe. Yeah.
That's the
86.
interferometric.
Yeah, so there are two
System.
antennas. The main one is the one that we used for years and years.
Yep.
First had the IRM radar in it.
IRM
and,
radar.
Then we decided to do work on interferometry, which involved 2 antennas. The bottom was active and the top passive.
Passive,
antenna.
yeah.
And but I remember there were issues about, well, okay, we're going to put this canoe on the side. What's going to happen? Can we still
exactly.
fly?
More test flying.
Yeah.
More test flying
Yeah.
with that on there.
Did you end up with a burble on the elevators,
No.
or it's high enough
No,
to?
yeah, it didn't create any problems at all, actually. It caused a little bit of a yaw because of the drag on it. It caused a little bit of yaw, right? But the trim took that away, and I think it was less than a half degree of trim required.
Just you set it up and
Nothing, yeah.
it becomes permanent. So once this thing was on there, you're committed to looking right all the time.
For interferometry, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, for the other antenna, we could image to the left or to the right. And the swaths would vary from our highest resolution mode, that'd be like 20 kilometers or something like that. But the wide swath would be up to 100 kilometers.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
And that was more typical of imaging radars to use a wide swath and wide angle. Let's talk about it's a turboprop. It
Right.
didn't start out that way. How did it
No.
start out?
No, well, it had the sort of World War II and post-World War II round engine, internal combustion engine, radial engines that the Convair 340 had, because it was a Convair 340, like a commuter airplane
Right.
for those days in the 50s. And at one point,
They took 50-some passengers, and
yeah, it was a 50 passenger
door
airplane.
coming down was a big feature, and yeah.
What was happening, and we had that same problem on our DC-3s at Inotech, is it was getting more and more expensive and harder to find a place to do the turnarounds, the time between overhaul inspections on these round engines, and expensive. So General Motors, the maker of Allison engines, gathered a whole bunch of those 340s and 440s and put the turbine engine, the same engines that were on the Electra, the Hercules,
Yep.
the Aurora, and it gave it a second life. It gave it enormous amounts of horsepower compared to what it had before.
Yeah, like 2,000 up to about
4,000.
4,000 horses. The 4,300 on the military Convair that
Right.
we had here in Ottawa, you know. But your wing is still 180 knot wing that we're driving at 300 knots now. So that becomes your drag limitation. It's got built-in drag. You just can't. Brute force and ignorance can only take you to so much speed. You know.
Yeah, and the conversion in 1962 with the larger engines, of course, you had to increase the rudder size because of the asymmetric effect. If you had an engine failure, you needed a lot more rudder to keep the airplane straight.
Okay.
And that was one of the things that was done in the conversion, as well as because the weight was increased to 54,000 pounds, I believe.
Yeah.
They increased the gear strength. They had to change the gear. And then, of course, we got recertified 58-156 so that we could carry fuel. But in the installation of the SAR system, we lost about 2,300 pounds in terms of, capability, because that was what all that equipment in there weighed. It was a lot of weight.
Literally a ton of SAR stuff.
Which is, it's a sliding scale, so you can use fuel or you can use payload, but at one point...
So I think Bill told me there was 13 more square feet of rudder on there.
It's probably about
580,
yeah.
Probably about right. But you can imagine, when you have an engine failure on takeoff, you need every ounce of rudder you've got. You're right on the floor. Really. Trying to hold on to the airplane.
Keep it low side up.
Keep it right side up.
Okay, because it wants to twist.
Oh yeah,
it'll just
yaw like crazy.
Okay. What would you say? The yaw will advance the wing, which will then get more lift. As it gets more lift, it'll turn you upside down.
It's one of those things that goes out of control.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's why when you take one of these things off, it's a large enough airplane that has performance, designated performance. You cannot take off below a certain speed, which is your minimum control speed.
Yeah.
If you lose one, everything is predicated on should you have a power failure on one side. So it has auto feather. The engine will, the propeller will feather itself to minimize drag. And then if you've done your sums right, you go, as you said, full rudder, but that will keep you going straight. If you're at the right speed, at the right weight.
Yeah.
If you're below that,
you're not going to make it.
Not going to work out so well.
I had no appreciation why you needed more rudder until now. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, when you go from 2,000 to 4,000 horses, you got to do something with the tail. Lumping along in the summer.
And I think part of it was when you were doing SAR stuff, the focus was on the other operator. And I was just, somebody's supervisor.
Not enough
to
keep busy.
Yeah, but when you're with the SCAT, you're looking up and down. You're busy.
But not only that, we were in France. We were going out to looking for turbulent days, windy days. And just going around.
Going around and around and around.
The moisture stays in. The moisture stays in and runs down inside.
It literally rots the skin. We had to replace pieces of skin on both sides because it was perforated. It was actually perforated through into the fuselage, and you're pressurized. So now it's the ice shield has become your pressure roll, and that ain't good.
But it's still better than Paul Wells up NRC's airplane. The Ford can had leaked and they hadn't done anything about it. Yeah, and that's very corrosive. So they had to resheet the whole side of the airplane underneath there when they bought it. Yeah.
What's Larry Standish's name doing on there?
Yeah, he was just there helping at the end trying to stick it home. Right? All of that Ian doing. So I would like to have a real plaque that has everybody that had something to do with it on there. But he probably knew better than you and I what will get approved and what wouldn't.
Well, I suppose, yeah. You have screens and everything, keep the birds out. That's good.
Yeah, they did a pretty good job of.
They know from experience from some of the other birds they've had.
Of course, yeah.
No drip.
No. Well, there's probably no fuel in it. Period. No oil. No nothing. I wouldn't
Yeah.
think. Did they change? They stole our props.
No, the paint job is new, but those are the same props.
Well, who did that? That's
Ian,
not.
Ian and Larry.
Yeah.
Why? That's
They
not
just
normal.
they just decided to. You know what? For a while they had it was sitting in the hangar, and those guys had not much to do.
Yeah.
And that was one of the little
Keep 'em
things
busy.
they did.
Huh. Crazy.
And it didn't stand up very well. I mean, it wasn't on
Look, yeah.
long. You never
Oh,
flew
no.
with that
No.
one. It
No,
only
no.
flew maybe
It only flew the
a
once
half
that came.
hour after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a great job.
Oh, they wouldn't change. I mean, those blades are so hard to find. You remember Hartford
Well, I
was
know.
at one point there was only 32 blades worldwide.
That's right.
How much do these pitch back, Lindsay?
How much they pitch back?
Yeah.
In flight?
Well, when you're
Oh, and
going
in flight,
reverse,
in flight he's wide open. You almost got 45, 50 degrees
45,
of
50
bite.
degrees of pitch.
okay.
Yeah. But if you go to reverse,
Yeah.
Goes the other way.
This one will go in. Not a whole lot because you don't
No,
want
it
to be
doesn't take
you don't want to be exceeding 1,000 horsepower max, 1,200
Yeah,
horse,
1,200, yeah.
because otherwise you're going to decouple the engine.
Yeah.
Is that so?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, because it's made to push back. It's not made to go the other way. Yeah.
That's right. With the prop sort of driving into the gearbox at 1,200 horsepower, he'll let go. He'll say, "No,
Yeah.
too much for me."
Yeah. There's a lot of little subtleties that you guys know that nobody else
Yeah.
knows.
Oh, it's trivia. You don't want to know
Yeah.
most of the stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a nice engine. I mean, they're still building that engine today. More horsepower now, 5,000 horsepower
Are
instead
they?
of 4.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, these engines were derated. The only reason being the gearbox. The
Yeah.
gearbox was only capable of 4,000 horses.
Okay.
The engine could put out more than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a curious fact, maybe interesting. The engine itself took 8,000 horsepower to operate the engine alone, and it put out 4,000 to the
Really?
props.
To the
Wow.
prop.
So the
4,000
engine
goes to the propeller.
Yeah, no,
To,
4,000
to the gearbox.
Yeah, but it produces 12,000 horsepower when
Yeah.
it's
Doing
turning
that.
4,000 on the prop.
Okay.
So that big 40 kVA, 40,000 watt alternator on there is enormous amounts of power. It drives that. I mean, it's got. This is one of the reasons this was such a bonus airplane
Yeah.
for you. It's got so much electricity,
Yeah,
you know.
and you
got,
needed that.
You got generators making DC. You got these big alternators, huge things, making AC for you.
Why did they originally need that?
They didn't.
They didn't.
That was a mod.
There was
This was all DC.
Originally, the 340 is a DC airplane. When the T56 engines were on, or the Allison engines were put on, these things came with big alternator, the same ones that you get on the Boeing.
Yeah.
They're all the same.
Okay.
Big Westinghouse things, they're super.
Yeah, that was General Motors did that.
Yeah.
In their mods. But it created a lot of problems for them because now they got some stuff running AC being DC controlled. Yeah. And it's a real problem because all kinds of funny things happen when something pops or
Yeah, yeah.
Something changes.
But the high power, the 208 volts of AC was super because all this thing is
All the
de-iced.
de-icing.
All the de-iced, the whole front of the engine is de-iced
Is there
with voltage.
de-ice on the props or just on the?
Oh,
Right
yes.
there, these cuffs
Okay.
are all electric.
And what about the wing?
Air,
That's hot air. Hot air from the
in a
engine.
duct
Okay.
that runs out of the engine.
200 degrees.
The horse collars up there, the intakes,
Yeah.
on the ground, if you turn them on, they'll immediately burn up, catch on fire. There's so much electricity going through there, and they're so hot, they will immediately disintegrate.
Yeah.
And
So-
that happened once, and I was watching it happen.
Yeah.
So I know how
I
it
lost
looks like.
one in Oklahoma on a military Convair. Same thing. It just disintegrated.
Yeah.
It just came
Wow.
apart. But this is all heat. This is heated,
Yeah.
and then the whole mouth of the engine is heated.
It's heated.
So
Everything.
yeah, a lot of AC going there. 208 volts.
So this thing, I think the engine runs about
Yeah.
13 times
13.
around for every prop.
Yeah, 13,820.
13,820, 875 plus or minus 25.
Yeah.
So
And the
that
prop is at 1100 RPM.
Yeah, and constant. Well, you had
1020 actually,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay.
1020.
Yeah, there was a low speed idle and a high speed,
Yeah.
right? What was the low speed idle?
Well, it was basically
10,000
more
RPM.
than, it was 10.5.
Well,
It was basically a start thing.
Yeah.
It's hard for that engine with these props on it to start and go to full 13,875. It's very difficult. So they had two-stage start system where it came up to 10.5, warmed up, got sorted out, and then you upshifted for your taxiing and takeoff and all the rest.
Right. Well,
And that created some interesting things. Every once in a while, I recall distinctly once, this engine, birds had been making homes in the airplane. And they had, the way you get the engine running at 10,500 RPM is by bleeding air off the compressor stages so that it doesn't
Doesn't
go
choke.
faster
Doesn't
or
burn
whatever.
and choke.
So when that bleed valve is open, it's drawing very, very hot air off and it's dumping it out in the cell vents on the right side here. There's a big hole.
There's a hole that's now been plugged.
Yeah, it's been plugged. It's further up top.
Yeah.
But anyway, starting the left engine one day, and things are kind of looking funny, and the temperatures aren't looking right, and all of a sudden there's this big poof, and this bird nest comes flying out of the bleed valve chamber there, on fire.
on fire.
On fire.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the same thing happened once with the Stinger. Same thing. This was when we were in Environment Canada. We're sitting there in the summer, dry grass everywhere behind us, and we're sitting there with the tail hanging over the grass on the apron. I start the Stinger up, same thing. There was a bird's nest in there, and the Stinger wasn't starting. All of a sudden, big poof! Of course, I didn't see that. I saw this one, but I couldn't see that in the back.
Yeah.
But anyway, the big poof, and this bird's nest goes flying out on fire, sets all the grass on fire.
And behind it.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, it was too hilarious.
In an Uvik in the dark. And and we've had to run the right-hand boost pump because of to keep the Stinger going for hours and hours.
Keep fuel pressure up.
So, and it's been a bit of a leak, and there's been fuel leaking into the burn chamber, so that when we started the engine finally, it lit, and it lit the sky, the Arctic sky behind us, an enormous flame past the tail. I remember Roger and Dave Gardner sitting up front, and then they just turned, and they're running for cover.
There's engineers on the ground.
We had a tailpipe do that once too on start, and pulled fuel. Well, we had a couple of start attempts that were not successful for various reasons. But anyway, when it finally did,
fuel.
there was fuel laying around in the tailpipe that hadn't burned, of course. When it did start, it burned.
Yeah, it's gotta
real
burn.
quick.
Yeah.
Quite a flame.
My remembrance of startups was always, well, depending on how you park the airplane, but the air intake for ventilation inside, somewhere under at the back. And
There's one in the front of the wing right there, that hole.
Yeah.
And there's one underneath that big scoop.
Right.
Are the intakes for the heat exchangers.
Yeah, but if you're at the time, if you're actually using the Stinger for air conditioning,
That's the air you're getting.
That's the air you're getting is from the tail.
Well, there'd be this awful
Smell.
smell.
Well,
Yeah,
awful.
that would come in.
It's the smell of money. What are you
Yeah,
talking
well,
about?
maybe you're right. Yeah. Well, it's funny.
If you got the wind up the tail and you got the Stinger running, you're going to smell
Or
burnt
the
kerosene.
stench of kerosene.
It comes in.
Reed's wife, Louise,
Yeah.
came out here when this airplane landed, and we all walked up to it, and she said, "Oh, there's that smell." I remember that. She went to Japan with you guys,
she
to
did.
Europe,
Yeah.
and so on. But this was her home, she said. And,
Yeah.
But that smell came right back. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
kerosene.
does. It does.
Kerosene.
Well,
Oh, there she is.
ground, Westjet 224, echo for 22.
Westjet 224 ground, taxi in at your discretion on the apron.
Ready? Yep, ready. Westjet 224.
Selected. Turning.
Started. Well, test that. Power section's good. Gearbox. I guess we got a gate change for 26 for Westjet 224.
Westjet 224.
That's good. Save a lot off. I guess we got a gate change for 26 for Westjet 224.
Westjet 224.
That's good. Save a lot off.